In this lecture, I'll be discussing social inequality and its implications for individuals in uniquely situated positions within society. When we consider social inequality, it's important to keep in mind that today, contemporary nation states are socially stratified, and this is a consequence of the inequality of political authority. These inequalities manifest themselves in multiple forms, including gender, class, caste, race, ethnicity, and nationality. It's also important to keep in mind that there are complex interactions or intersectionalities between each one of these different divisions or classifications within society as a whole. It's also important to keep in mind that these categories are cultural inventions, some of which have existed for a very long time, such as gender, class, and caste, or have emerged relatively recently with a so-called age of expansion, exploration, or colonial conquest in the contact between the so-called Old World and New World that we talked about in the context of the section on social complexity. These more recent manifestations include race, ethnicity, and nationality to explain and justify differences between individuals. And we'll see how this has very dramatic impacts in terms of power or transformative capacity that we discussed in the context of political anthropology as we go through many of the sections continuing in this class. Anthropologists are concerned with how these categories should be defined and if such definitions are applicable cross-culturally. So why does this matter in the context of world problems? Inequality, it has many ramifications in terms of everyday life opportunities and chances for individuals. And Paul Farmer talks about this in the context of Haiti. This is from Goultong's work in the late 1960s on the idea of structural violence. It's violence that results from the way that political and economic forces will structure risk for various forms of suffering within a population along the lines of social inequality. So Farmer looks at structural violence in Haitian society. He looks at this from a medical anthropology perspective. He notes that the forms of structural violence include things like infectious and parasitic diseases, extreme suffering such as hunger, torture, as well as rape. This is structural because violence is directed at these Haitians due to their unequal positions in society itself, along the lines of gender and race, for example. He gives a couple of examples of Sefi, a poor young woman who entered into a relationship with a soldier, which was considered a step up socially. However, due to the promiscuity of the soldier, she ended up contracting AIDS. For Chuchu, a male, he made a remark that was interpreted as being criticism of those in ruling power, and the result here was massive torture of the individual. According to Farmer, the agency of Asefi and Chuchu was curbed at every turn. Their unequal positions greatly increased the likelihood that they would be subjected to suffering as well as death. And so this goes to the notion of the discussion that we had earlier in the context of politics and economics about the notion of free will versus structure within society and how much free will do individuals truly have. And for Farmer and others, the position that individuals occupy in society would be in large part determinative of the potential outcomes and opportunities for said individual. So we'll talk about some of these aspects of social inequality in turn. First, gender. In the 1970s, feminist anthropologists asked the question, was male dominance a feature of all societies? Ortner in 1974 created this notion of a binary as an intellectual construct, noting that female was to male as nature is to culture. That is, women were considered to be closer to nature because they gave birth and raised their offspring. Eleanor Leacock, building off the work of Frederick Engels' Rise of Private Property in the State, noted that women's subordination might be more related to the rise of private property in the state rather than the inevitability of male dominance, and that through ethnographic and historical evidence showing the impact of capitalist colonialism and its effect on transforming egalitarian indigenous gender relations into unequal male-dominated gender relations. And this occurs in the context of, for example, fur trade, where there becomes a shift in subsistence practices which would focus more on the roles of both males and females in subsistence, such as amongst the Patek that we saw an example of in the work from Endicott in their book, Headman Was a Woman. Here you have relatively egalitarian societies that could potentially be transformed with market interventions overall, favoring the production of one good and one gender, typically males who are engaged in the production of one good. From Bolt, you guys have a assigned reading for the week on Marilyn Asensio's work, Machos and Sluts, where she talks about gender, sexuality, and violence amongst a cohort of Puerto Rican adolescents in New York. And she goes through and discusses machismo and the characteristics of gender-appropriate roles for male and female. And she notes that in many health interventions, there is a call for calling forth this cultural idea of machismo, and that this machismo exists indeed evenly throughout all of Latin America and Latin American societies. However, many scholars have pointed out many flaws with this notion of the universal existence of machismo, and it's been heavily critiqued within academic work. Nevertheless, in applied medical settings, the notion of machismo is still drawn from the care and the responsibility that men should have both towards daughters and mothers to protect them from any sort of transgression. And so this is looked at in the health context as well. Now, what Asensio does is she looks at the implications for machismo and male pattern behavior and what that means for females as a whole. And she notes that this trade-off is not really a good idea in terms of framing women as rather passive and indeed as objects, as males would typically perceive them under this under a regime of machismo outside of familial relations of sister or mother. Karl Marx, as we've noted before in the context of economic anthropology, talked quite a bit about class and the capitalist class as a whole. Class can be considered a ranked group within a hierarchically stratified society whose membership is defined primarily in terms of wealth, occupation, or other economic criteria. European social sciences classified social class dating back to the Middle Ages and the French and Industrial Revolutions, where you had attempts to break the system and equalize access to wealth. Probably most notably amongst these was Karl Marx, along with Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto. Marx thought that classes and unequal relations are determined by relationships to the means of production, the capitalist mode of production, which requires industrial entrepreneurs and industrial working class, where of course the working class are required to sell their labor in order to survive. And so Marx and Engels called for a social revolution to create class consciousness, which would oust the capitalist class overall. In contemporary society today, we see that class consciousness is hampered by institutions of clientage, which are institutions linking individuals from upper and lower levels of society, making power relations between individuals and not groups. And so we see examples from Latin America, where you have ritual co-parenthood allows for economic relief of low-status people and political support for higher-status people. In the United States, of course, there's this notion of the American dream, where social classes are defined by income and upward social mobility is possible. In the context of Hindu castes, these are supported by a system shaped by religious beliefs as a part of the social order as a whole. And so there's these narratives within the United States of this notion of the American dream. You can see some of the images here from early on, and still President Obama talking about reclaiming the American dream, reimagining America, and getting back to things that are very American, this notion of the American dream. Castes are ranked groups within a hierarchically stratified society that's closed, which prohibits individuals to move from one caste to another. They are a stratification system, probably the most typically noted is in India, but we also see examples in Japan and Rwanda, as well as other locations throughout the globe. Castes are endogamous, based on occupational groupings, or based on ruling elites who believe they are above others. Race is a human population category whose boundaries allegedly will correspond to distinct sets of biological attributes. The concept of race has roots dating back to European colonial activities in the Americas and the African slave trade of the 15th century. Theories regarding divisions of humans into races are defined by phenotypic appearance, based on genotype as well as norm of reaction in the environment, and common features that are believed to be shared by all of those within a specific race, such as language or intelligence. Racism is based on this notion of imagined communities from Benedict Anderson, as there are no major biological discontinuities, within the human species. Rather, we see the intergradation of clines. Racism is the systematic oppression of one or more socially defined races by another socially defined race that is justified in terms of the supposed inherent biological superiority of the rulers and the supposed inherent biological inferiority of those that they rule. Race is culturally constructed, and it's developed to describe a particular reality, and that there are multiple understandings of whiteness or class differences which exists in cross-cultural contexts, such as the U.S. South, the notion of white trash, or in South Africa. You also have multiple understandings of blackness in Haiti, as well as increasingly in the United States, where we see increases in complications of historic divides of racism. In some contexts, we see that race is not a stable category, and this is based on Lancaster's work in Nicaragua, where he studied mestizo populations and indigenous mosquitoes and African Caribbean minorities of the Atlantic coast. And he found that the mestizos see these groups as backward, inferior, and dangerous. And the notion of colorism came about here. And colorism in Nicaragua is based upon three color classifications: a phenotypic system, a polite system, and a pejorative system. Whiteness is seen as a desired quality, and it's situational depending on who is present. Thus, attempts at racial solidarity are difficult in this context because one does not want to define oneself for once and all time as a member of a specific race, but rather it's situational. Ethnicity is a principle of social classification used to create groups based on selected cultural features such as language, religion, and dress. Therefore, ethnicity and race are fundamentally different. The struggle with ethnicity revolves around the idea of self-ascription versus other ascription. Self-ascription would be those insiders or members of a particular ethnicity defining their own identity in terms of things like language, religion, or dress, versus other ascription where outsiders define identities for individuals. And so this is a fundamental notion of power. Ethnicity certainly ties into notions of different ethnic groups, and as was mentioned earlier in class, much of Africa has historically been divided up amongst European colonial powers across ethnic lines, and many times having disastrous impacts in the post-colonial era, as you see fighting between various ethnic groups who struggle for control of the state as a whole. When dominant ethnic groups stress their cultural superiority, perhaps in protecting privilege from subordinate groups, ethnicity can become racialized. So you see racialized groups in the United States, including class stereotypes historically amongst the Irish, Jews, as well as Italians. This, however, can be reversed depending on the situation. The Irish in the United States became less stigmatized or less marked, though it is argued that they were successful in this because they accepted the racialization of African Americans as a whole. In terms of nationality and nation, a nation is a group of people who believe they share the same history, culture, and language, and even physical substance. And nation states are these ideal political unities where national identity and political territory coincide. And so there's this notion of nation building, this attempt to ferment nationality of individuals, and we see this with a long history and complicated history between England and Ireland as Ireland struggles for independence from England. In terms of transformist hegemony, nationalist programs to define nationality in order to preserve the cultural domination of the ruling group while including enough of the features from the subordinate group to ensure their loyalty. There are a diversity of ethnic identities within a nation state call into questionability or to question the feasibility of nationalism as a whole. And of course, this occurs quite a bit within the United States. I mean, what actually makes us members of the same nation? How do we in the United States think about being members of the same nation or having the same physical substance or sharing with individuals this sense of identity as American? Nationalism also ties into attempts to reclaim identity in the context of states. So the idea of nationality and states are not necessarily politically coinciding. Historically, we see with Australian nationalism, Aborigines who were denied citizenship and claims to land under the legal notion of terra nullius, the idea of ownership, can only be recognized if there were specific interventions on the land, such as agriculture. And to Europeans who saw many indigenous populations throughout the globe, when they first came to these areas, they didn't actually see any evidence of civilization or progress or indeed ownership of land.